My name is Beth, and I'm the events manager at Main Street Books. And I'm here on behalf of Ada and the rest of the staff to say welcome. One of the great privileges of my work so far, this is my first year in the role, but a true treat has been getting to know some of the members of Charlotte Writers Club North and working with them to put together really meaningful and important events. And I so appreciate the thought and the care and the planning that goes into these spaces, into these evenings. And so I wanted to first just say thank you, Charlotte Writers Club North, for working with Main Street Books and for partnering us and for choosing us. It's also my treat tonight to introduce our moderator for the evening. And after I introduce her, she will then introduce our featured guest, Anne. So first, I'm pleased to say hello to Dee Dee Mitchell. Hi, Dee Dee.
Hello.
Hey, Dee Dee Mitchell is a member of the Charlotte Writers Club North Board. She writes poetry, essays, and fiction. Her work has appeared in North Carolina Literary Review, Celiac 2013, Amethyst Review, and Cider Press Review, among other publications. You can also find some of her writing at ourblueboat.org, a blog that celebrates and muses on our relationship with the earth. And before I turn it over to Dee Dee to run with this program, I just wanted to give a few housekeeping notes. First of all, if you could please stay on mute. You're welcome to keep your video on. It's sometimes nice for our speakers to be able to see friendly faces staring back. But please do stay on mute. This is an interactive program, however, and so we really encourage you as Anne reads sections and Dee Dee asks questions. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat. You can just write them out in the chat feature and Dee Dee will bring those forward to Anne as they converse. If you have any issues with that or any technical needs along the way, please don't hesitate to message me directly and we can get that solved. So without further ado, thank you for being here tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to Dee Dee Mitchell.
Thank you, Beth. Hello, everyone. It's so good to see your faces. I recognize a number of you. Thanks for being here. I'm really happy to be introducing our friend Anne Campanella this evening. You know, I've known of Anne for a long while, but it's only in recent years that we've become friends. And I think I have the better end of that arrangement. Anne is a former magazine and newspaper editor, a poet, and a memoir writer. In her latest memoir, Celiac Mom, she tells the story of taking on gluten-free living after her daughter is diagnosed with celiac disease. It has been named a finalist for 2 awards, the 2020 Wishing Shelf Book Award and the 2020 Indies Today Book Award. Here's what Tony Abbott had to say about Celiac Mom. The thing I like best about this fascinating and timely book is how valuable it is for those of us who do not have celiac and who need very badly to understand it if we are to help those, often members of our own family, who do have gluten allergies. You know, that I thought that was such a good observation. Even if we may not have celiac disease or gluten sensitivities ourselves, we probably know someone who does. And Anne's story shines a clear light on what it can be like for them and how we can help. Anne's writing has been published around the world. She's authored 2 other award-winning books, Motherhood Lost and Found, a memoir of her mother's Alzheimer's illness, and a collection of poems entitled What Flies Away. And she's published 3 other collections of poetry as well. Anne is a gifted poet and storyteller, and she brought both of these to bear in writing Celiac Mom. I found it to be an engaging story of her and her family's challenges in diagnosing her daughter's illness, followed by their sometimes surprising, sometimes frustrating, and ultimately successful journey into gluten-free living. Like you, I'm looking forward to hearing her read from it this evening. So Anne, please join me in welcoming Anne, and I turn it over to you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Dee Dee. That was just a beautiful, beautiful introduction, and I'm very touched by that. And love that you brought Tony Abbott into it, because the last time I was on Zoom with many of you, it was in honor of Tony. And that just is nice to think of him and his spirit being with us tonight. So I appreciate that. And thank you, Beth and Ada, who is working behind the scenes. We're so grateful to Main Street Books. You guys are just wonderful. You support our community in so many ways, and we just can't thank you enough for all you do. And thank you also to Charlotte Writers Club North and Charlotte Writers Club. We have an incredible community of writers, people who are supportive, engaged, folks who will just do almost anything to help other writers in our community. And I urge you, if you're a writer, to get connected with Charlotte Writers Club or Charlotte Writers Club North. We have lots of programs that are just wonderful to be a part of. So with that, I will just jump into a little introduction about Celiac Mom and my life, I guess. Some of you probably know me as the person who has written most about Alzheimer's. And that is true. I spent a good 20 years writing my memoir, Motherhood Lost and Found. And at the end of that book, my daughter Sydney was born. And little did I know that that was going to be the start of my next memoir. I went through a period of time where I was caregiving on both ends of the spectrum. And at that time, I was kind of going crazy, and I was trying to take care of my mom, trying to take care of my little girl. And I had no idea that she had these things. I noticed things that were going on with her, but I didn't realize what it was. Probably the biggest thing was she wasn't sleeping well. And I thought, well, maybe she's just sort of picking up on my stress in being a caregiver. But little did I know that was not the case. She was not sleeping, probably due to the gluten in her system. And that was a symptom that I had no idea could be connected to something like celiac disease. She had other symptoms, like she was bloated all the time, she was hungry, she wasn't growing properly. When she was 5 years old and in preschool, she was head and shoulders smaller than all of her classmates. And as a mom, you can imagine that was very concerning. And I would talk to doctors and be like, something's wrong here. This is not normal. And they would pat me on the head and say, you're just a nervous mom. She's fine. She's healthy. She'll spurt up at some point. And I have to say, I don't blame my doctor, because she was wonderful. She just wasn't educated in celiac disease. And I kind of pride myself that I brought her along with it, or Sydney and I both did. And she did become a very big supporter of me. But it took some time. And so that's kind of the place where I'll start. I'm going to read. Well, before I read, I need to give a disclaimer. As I told Dee Dee the other day, I like to think I know a lot, but I'm not a doctor. And so please don't take any of my experience as something to disregard your own doctor's suggestions or advice. So basically the standard medical disclaimer. But I am going to go ahead and read the prologue to Celiac Mom, and that will give you a sort of a sense of where we were, my husband and I, before Sydney's celiac disease, and then how we reoriented very quickly once we got the diagnosis. So, and the first couple of paragraphs are actually about us taking Sydney to her endoscopy, which was kind of a scary thing to put a little 5-year-old through when she only took up about a third of the hospital bed, to see them wheeling her away. But it was something that was necessary for her diagnosis. So a few hours still before dawn, my husband and I get up, shower, force ourselves to eat a small breakfast. I gather Sydney, still warm from sleep, into my arms and whisper, "It's time for us to go." She nods sleepily against me, her pale cheeks slightly damp. I kiss the top of her head as I settle our 5-year-old into her car seat. Are we doing the right thing? Will she be okay? Am I an overly concerned mom putting my daughter through needless procedures? Have I blown her symptoms out of proportion in my imagination? Her stomach pain, constipation, inability to nap, her small stature? Maybe all these things are normal, part of raising a healthy child. This morning, the nurse at the hospital will prep her, and Sydney will be anesthetized. The doctor will take samples of the tissue in her small intestine, send it to a lab, and with any luck, within a few days, we will know whether or not our daughter has celiac. I have never been a cook. In fact, Joel and I survived for years on a diet of microwave dinners and takeout food. Most weekends, we treated ourselves with a delicious 4-inch high wheat bread sandwich made from our local chain that had the word bread in it, topping off the meal with a huge chocolate chip cookie made with wheat flour. A few hours later, we'd pick up subs with whole wheat rolls if we were being virtuous, or visit our favorite Italian restaurant for plates of baked ziti, noodles made with what else but wheat. Wheat was our family's mainstay. We survived on it, planned around it, looked forward to it, even drooled over it. Gluten was a foreign concept, one of those weird words that overly health-conscious people used, people who like to make others, like us, feel guilty. All that would change when we learned that our daughter had celiac disease. What does it mean when someone is diagnosed with celiac? In medical terms, according to the Celiac Disease Foundation, when someone who has celiac eats gluten, an immune response is set off, which damages the villi, tiny finger-like projections in the small intestine. When these villi are blunted, they can no longer absorb nutrients. This leads to autoimmune disorders and other health issues, which can be serious, such as anemia, arthritis, liver disorders, delayed growth, and failure to thrive, to name a few. In human terms, my daughter was not being nourished. After breakfast, she'd rest on the couch holding her stomach. Her low energy kept her sitting still and playing with blocks and puzzles instead of constantly being on the go like other toddlers. An intense heat in Sydney's body made her kick off her shoes and peel back her blankets, even in the dead of winter. She couldn't take long naps or sleep through the night, even through the age of 5. And most concerning to me, her mother, she was not growing at a normal rate. For our family, a celiac diagnosis meant we had to accept a major change in our lives if we were going to support Sydney. Forevermore, I would become a detective on the lookout for any and all foods that contained gluten. It was one of those things that went beyond choice. It was a decision made for my husband and me, knit within our very DNA from the moment we met our daughter in the flesh, before she was born even. She was a precious new part of our family, a miraculous gift from God. She was, of course, I would do this. I would do much more, anything it took to care for her, to keep her healthy, to help her thrive. This was a medical necessity for Sydney. The presence of gluten in her diet was damaging her intestines and keeping her malnourished. From a practical standpoint, our small family suddenly found itself outside the norm, and it was my job as the mother to help us navigate this transition. We had to remove ourselves from the countless typical routines that involved food. I had to approach each meal with a new set of eyes, an awareness that a poison could be lurking. A food that could undermine my daughter's health was always close by. I had to figure out how to deconstruct our patterns around the grain my husband and I had spent a lifetime eating and find a way to build new habits and traditions that would not compromise Sydney's health and ultimately ours, but instead provide nourishment. I spent hours on the internet plugging her symptoms into search engines: severe constipation, delayed growth, sleeplessness, stomach pain, etc. On occasion, over time, certain words like gluten and celiac showed up amidst a constellation of other health concerns. But it was enough that when a specialist finally told me he wanted to run further tests and perform an endoscopy on Sydney because he suspected celiac, all the disparate pieces of my daughter's digestive issues and childhood history fluttered around me and finally began to fall into place. It was my first sign of hope.
Thank you, Anne. What a beautiful
welcome.
way to begin that story. I was really struck that you put a prologue in, and I think it just beautifully set us up for the rest of and I wondered about your thinking around that, and maybe you could talk to us a little bit about how you structure the book and what made you decide to put a prologue in.
Sure, that's a great question. I think I chose to put the prologue in because after writing the whole piece, which went chronologically, I felt like I didn't want to throw people in without giving them some sense of just a ground to stand on, like where we were. We were not experts. We were just regular people who, were addicted to wheat. And then also to give a sense of, what were the crazy things that were happening without going into too much detail, but just really, I was hoping to help the reader either relate to it, hook them into the story, and kind of go from there.
Yeah, it did that. It gave us a nice foundation to start with.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, glad. And Dee Dee, I just want to say real quickly to everybody who's here, thank you so much for coming. I forgot to welcome everyone, and I'm just so grateful to have you all be a part of this event.
Yeah, it's good to
and
see
hope you'll feel
everybody.
free to ask questions and just join in any way.
I have a few more questions, but before I ask them, is there anybody here who has a question before I jump in with mine? All us fellow introvert. Richard.
Yeah. Hi, Ann. How are you doing?
Doing well. Hey, Richard. Good to see you.
How old was your daughter when you first noticed these symptoms? How old is she now? And how is she doing now?
Great questions. I noticed these symptoms early on, from probably before she turned 1. She had a little Buddha belly and teeny like stick-like arms and legs, which it's funny, as a parent, I think you get used to your child, and it's only now as I look back at pictures and I'm like, oh my gosh, I should have known sooner that she had this major issue, but you just get used to seeing what you see. And one of the things very early on, before she was 1, even when she started, well, I guess probably when she started eating solid food that had wheat in it, that's when things happened. And that's when her appetite became just voracious. And that was happening because she could not absorb the nutrients that were going into her body. So she might, like when she was 2 or 3 years old, she'd eat a complete dinner. And I'd think, wow, I thought toddlers were picky, but she ate everything. And then 5 or 10 minutes later, she would be begging for a second dinner. And I'd think, what is going on? So, but she was diagnosed at the age of 5. So it took us a while, but right now they say a typical diagnosis takes 6 to 10 years. And she is 19 years old now and doing great. She's adjusted. Living with celiac is not easy, but she does very well with it.
Great. That's such good news. Wow. We have a few more questions. From Leah Frazier. Can you test for celiac disease with a blood test, or do you need an endoscopy?
Yes, you can test with a blood test. They are not always accurate. Probably mostly they are accurate, but I say they're not because Sydney's blood test was not accurate. My blood test was not accurate. Sydney, all of the numbers were like in normal range, except one was borderline. But when she had her endoscopy, and the endoscopy is the gold standard for testing. So if you really want to know, you get the endoscopy. But once she had her endoscopy, the surgeon said he did not even need to test any further or have the results sent to the lab. He said he could tell there was severe scarring in her gut. So that was all he needed to see.
Yeah. Gosh. Another question. They're just flying in now.
Oh my goodness.
Here's a question about the book again, and I might save some of these. Yeah, here's one more question about the book, and then we might move on. We'll see.
Okay.
When and how did you decide you wanted to compose the book, and how long did it take you? There's a lot of risk in the memoir. How did you come to terms with that? This is from Tamara.
Yes.
Good questions.
It's funny, I was talking to Sydney about this yesterday and trying to get her thoughts on it because I couldn't remember exactly. And we both kind of thought I think I started when I remember I taught her a writing class, Sydney and her friend Lauren Kate. And I remember thinking, I need to be doing some writing myself in order to model what a writer does. And I gave them this exercise to just write a list of things that had emotional resonance for them. And so I thought, well, I'll just do that too. And my list happened to be all these memories of Sydney dealing with celiac. And that list, I did that probably 5 or 6 years ago when she was 12 or 13. And that list became the seeds for the memoir. And how long did it take? Once I really got going, I'd say it took 2 or 3 years to finish it, which was lightning speed compared to Motherhood Lost and Found, which took me 20 years.
Wow. Yeah, 20. Oh,
20.
That is light speed.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't working on it all the time, but I was taking care of my mom and, picking it up and putting it down.
Right. It was a busy time. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how old was Sydney? I missed that when you were.
She was, when she was diagnosed.
No, when you were teaching her and her friend.
I think I started teaching them when they were about 9 or 10, and I taught them for a few years. It was homeschooling.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think that exercise was done when she was about 12.
Okay. Wow. So, all right. That gives us a good idea.
And was there a question about Sydney's reaction to the story?
There is. Well, the last part of Tamara's question is there's a lot of risk in memoir, and how did you come to terms with that? And then someone else did have a question about Sydney's reaction to this story. Yes.
Yes. Those are things I definitely want to address, because writing a story about a family member, and especially a teenager, teenagers, as I'm sure most of you know, they have no interest in having their life spilled out into the public. And Sydney in particular was, like me, more on the introverted side. And mostly, it's interesting because she had celiac, it was very important for her just to fit in, as I guess it is with all teenagers. And celiac was something that made her not fit in. So she didn't really want to tell people about it. But interestingly, she was very happy to have me write the story, because it was an opportunity for her to show people what it was about. And she struggled with a lot of aspects of just living with celiac, because her friends could do things that she couldn't do. And that was a daily issue. And I think to be able to have me write about it in a way. And I made the decision to write about it, calling the book Celiac Mom, so that it was my perspective of her condition and disease, rather than trying to say, okay, this is what Sydney felt. Because I felt like that was a way to protect her privacy a little bit. I could, show what she was doing, but I didn't have to get inside her head. And that might have driven her crazy if I'd done that.
Right.
So I would say she actually came to the point of really loving the book. But I mean, she started out, it's funny, she'd be like, Mom, don't make me listen to another chapter. I'll just read it when it's done. And I'd be like, whoa, you've got to read this, or you've got to hear it. So I'd break it up into small chunks and try to find a time when she was in a good mood and say, let me just, read a couple pages to you. And then she'd kind of enjoy it, because, who doesn't like to have some attention, brought to her. And I would say, is this right? Do you agree? Was this, what you wanted out of, this? Is there something else I should say? And so she'd give a little bit of feedback, and that was kind of fun to do. So.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So one more question about, there's a lot of questions about writing memoir, I think.
Yes.
and there was one more question that I see right now about publishing, thoughts about publishing when people in your memoir are still alive. Do you have what thoughts about that?
Yeah, yes. It's funny. My husband, he's been through this drill before, and he is just very open and very happy-go-lucky. And he's just like, just don't make me look dumb, Anne. And I'm like, well, I'll try not to. Just don't do something dumb. But so it was never a problem with him. But with Sydney, it was just a different set of circumstances. This was her life and her condition that she's dealing with. So, as I say, she came to the point, thankfully, by the time I published this, she was going off to college, or sort of, I guess she was in high school and looking towards college. So she wasn't thinking about it as much. So she was okay with whatever went out. But if I'd tried to do it a little sooner, it probably wouldn't have been a good idea.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, why don't we move on to the next excerpt, if that's
Sure.
Okay. All right.
Sure. And I'm thinking I might skip one, and I'll go right to, I'm just changing things on the fly, Dee Dee.
That's fine. I'm hoping you're not going to skip the one I want you to read.
Well, since I talked about Joel, I'll tell his little section.
Good.
Because once Sydney was diagnosed with celiac, I decided to go gluten-free in solidarity with her, because I didn't want her to be the only one in our 3-person family who couldn't have all the great stuff that we were used to eating. And I also suspected that I had some issues with gluten, which I do. But Joel was not so eager to give up what he was used to eating. And we were pretty sure that he probably didn't have any issues with gluten, because as we sort of jokingly call him in the family, he's the golden retriever to Sydney and I are the cats in the family. And he's, just extroverted, and he's not real sensitive about things. He's, very happy, but things just don't bother him. Like Sydney and I, we feel, the tiniest little prick. And so it was interesting to see. I'll take it from here and read his little story. So Joel surprised me one day by announcing he was ready to go off gluten. In fact, without my help, he'd calculated a 7-week trial for himself that would end auspiciously on the day he was leaving for a golf trip to the mountains with 7 of his guy friends. As was typical for Joel, once he made a decision, he committed to it. He didn't go back and forth or gnaw on the details as if they were a bone the way I did. Instead, he asked for help in mapping out what was safe for him to eat on a daily basis. I was happy to oblige, knowing this could be a step on our journey towards a completely gluten-free household. Joel's breakfast was usually cereal, and he was happy to eat one of the brands I'd picked up for Sydney at the health food store. Dinners were not a problem because I'd be making those. Lunch was the biggest concern. Joel was now semi-retired, so during the summer, he usually got up early to play golf and came home to eat a sandwich made with whole wheat bread and deli turkey. He'd have to lose the bread, but he seemed fine with the idea of a pile of turkey supplemented with a handful of carrots, an apple, and a gluten-free cookie or two. But if his tea time was mid-morning, his old pattern was to buy a hot dog after 9 holes at the turn shop or order a late lunch, a BLT, club sandwich, or hamburger with fries, after he finished playing 18 holes. He could still eat hamburgers and hot dogs, just no buns, and he had to nix the fries in case they were cooked in oil that had been contaminated with gluten. I took a look at his golf course menu and told him he could have the following sides: a fruit cup, salad or veggies with no toppings. I watched Joel's face to see what his response would be to no fries. Surprisingly, there was none. He just seemed pleasantly appreciative of my help. Of course, a small part of me wondered if my husband could really handle gluten-free living. Just because Sydney and I had been doing it for a couple of months didn't mean Joel could cut it. I mean, a change like this took intestinal fortitude, no pun intended. A couple of weeks into his new eating regimen, I asked Joel how it was going. He replied nonchalantly, "Great, it's pretty easy. As long as I know what to eat and what not to eat, I'm fine." Easy? He'd forgotten that just the other day I'd grabbed a bag of mixed nuts out of his hands and read the ingredients out loud. Peanuts, almonds, walnuts, sea salt, wheat. "What do you mean wheat? It's a bag of nuts," he said. "Not all brands are gluten-free. You've got to look at the ingredients," I huffed. He shrugged and looked into the can. "I don't see any wheat. There can't be too much." "It's enough to hurt Sydney," I said. "Yeah, maybe, but not me." Joel's response just underlined how completely different we were. Me, the detail-oriented, slightly neurotic, very protective food planner, versus him, the relaxed, easygoing, "what's the problem with a little wheat" guy. The weeks passed quickly, and every time Sydney and I asked Joel if he felt any different, he'd cock his head as if scanning his body. After a moment's pause, he'd say, "I don't think so. Pretty sure I'm doing this for nothing." "You might be," I'd respond, "but at least you'll know." "Yeah, and then I can get back to eating whatever I want," Joel said with a grin. During the last week of Joel's fast from all, or at least most things gluten, I got a phone call from him. He'd gone to the nearby town of Salisbury to pick up some golf clubs that had been reshafted in preparation for his trip to the mountains. He didn't sound like his usual upbeat self. "And I don't feel so good," he said. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Are you sick?" It was 2 days before his trip. Usually he was filled with high energy before a golf trip. "I feel awful." His voice was low and there wasn't a trace of his typical enthusiasm. "What's going on?" A tiny thought flickered through my mind. Had he fallen off the gluten-free wagon? That couldn't be it. A little gluten had never bothered him before. Joel unraveled his tale for me. When he went to the golf shop, he found that his clubs weren't quite ready. It was past 2:00. He'd been on the golf course since early that morning, then on the road to Salisbury, and he was hungry. There was a Subway next door, and the scent of fresh baked bread lured him inside. He quickly rationalized he was going off gluten in a few days anyway, so why not just grab something? He ordered one of his old favorites, a 6-inch meatball sub, and devoured it quickly. "It's only been 20 minutes and I feel like I'm hungover," Joel said. "My head's foggy and I feel run down. All I want to do is come home and take a nap." What? I'd heard Joel, but I was having trouble computing everything. He'd eaten gluten and done it before the deadline he'd given himself, and now he felt awful. Could it be, after all this time, that Joel was just as intolerant to gluten as I was, maybe even Sydney? "So you feel bad?" I asked, just to be sure. "I feel horrible. I'm never eating wheat again."
This is
Joel.
one of my favorite scenes.
Joel's always a fun character.
Yes. I was glad you weren't skipping that one. So one question that I have is he still off gluten? Has he maintained?
He has.
Wow.
And interestingly, in the beginning, he mostly was off gluten. And then every now and then, if there was a yummy dessert or something he just couldn't stop himself from eating, he would indulge. But after maybe a year or two, he realized, and this is sort of a joke in our family, but it affected his golf game. So he decided to give it up completely. So, so he does not eat wheat or gluten. He's really careful about it. He does eat other stuff he probably shouldn't, but he's been good.
Good for him. The other question, I think a question like this came in, and it's a question I had too. So it has to do with the difference between an intolerance or sensitivity and having celiac disease. So,
Yes,
yeah.
that's a great question and really an important one. Celiac disease is basically the autoimmune condition that causes the body to react to gluten. And it basically attacks the gluten. And in attacking the gluten, it attacks the body. And that's what causes, over time, a lot of serious symptoms. Gluten intolerance is sort of a wavy line. Gluten intolerance has a lot of the same symptoms. There might be bloating. You might have trouble sleeping. You might be extra hungry. You might have like sore muscles and things like that, or a headache. But with gluten intolerance, typically you don't actually have an autoimmune response. So it's something that the body can recover from. And that's why I feel like the line is very wavy, because I think a lot of people might think they have gluten intolerance, but if over time, if they continued to eat wheat, they probably would have more reaction, or it would affect them in a deeper way than they know. And that's just my own, again, don't quote me, but that's just how I feel, because nobody has said I have celiac. So I often say, well, I have gluten intolerance, but I wouldn't be surprised if I have celiac, because my symptoms are so intense when I do eat wheat.
Okay. Wow. So is celiac, so Sydney had it from the time, maybe is this something you can be born with, or it can develop over in your lifetime? Okay.
Both. Basically, celiac is you have a genetic predisposition for it. And if you have those genes, if you have those genes, they can be turned on at just about any time. And typically they're turned on when you start eating wheat and introducing that to the body. For me, what I think is celiac was turned on when I gave birth to Sydney. And they say giving birth can be a trauma to the body, and anything that is trauma could be a car accident, or a really serious headache, or there's just so many different things that could cause that. Whereas you might not have been showing signs of celiac for most of your life, it can suddenly come on.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's very helpful. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Related to that, what steps do you recommend people take who suspect they might have celiac or other wheat intolerance? This is from Helen.
Great question. Probably go see someone like Helen, who is a very good nutritionist, or someone, she knows a lot. I'm not sure what her degree is. But I would say the first thing would be to get a blood test, and the blood test will likely show something. If it doesn't, and you are sure that you have some kind of response, then you could go straight to the endoscopy. But the other thing, and this is what I did, and I would recommend people do this, is have an elimination diet where they just take wheat out of their diet, basically like Joel did, or you can take out, all the major allergens and then gradually put them back. Because with gluten, it's really interesting. If you've been eating it all your life, you're not really going to feel the symptoms. Everything's just kind of muted because you're used to it. It's only when you take wheat or gluten out of your diet for an extended period, could be a month, it could be 2 months, and then you add it back in when you really feel what it's doing to you. Like for me, I took it out of my diet, and then every now and then I'd be like, oh, I've got to have a cookie, and I'd eat a cookie, and then I'd just feel horrible. Like Joel, I'd feel like I had a hangover. My joints were achy. I couldn't sleep for 3 days, or couldn't sleep through the night. And just various things like that would suddenly show up.
Yeah, wow. Okay, there are a couple other questions in here related to writing that we can ask now or we can wait. Do you have a preference?
Maybe I should go ahead and read the last section, and then we can
Okay.
do the other questions.
Okay.
Because I wanted to share this scene because it gives you a glimpse into what happens when you have an exposure, if you have celiac disease. And I just think that's important. And this is from Sydney's 10th birthday. And she had been gluten-free for years, and we had been just so careful about it. And she really wanted pizza and birthday cake because everybody else has pizza. So we actually went to a chef that we trusted because either he had celiac or someone in his family had celiac, and he made the dough. And then he left it for the staff of, it was basically Joel's club, and they were going to put the ingredients on. And we, knew it was going to be safe. It was just cheese and pepperoni, and made sure it was gluten-free pepperoni. And so anyway, that's where this section starts. So So when the boxes of pizza arrived, I could see the look of glee on Sydney's face. Just the mere fact that it looked like the kind of pizza that people without allergies ate brought her joy. It had the same pools of oil glistening among the pepperoni and cheese, and the aroma of fresh baked crust was divine. Pizza for everyone. The moms and the kids at the party all grabbed slices, and the food disappeared quickly, but no one enjoyed the pizza more than Sydney. This was her day, and she wasn't going to miss the opportunity to relish this food. She ate one piece and then another and another until her tiny stomach had room for only one more thing: cake. The kids gathered around and sang happy birthday as Sydney smiled. She asked for a corner of cake with one of the cat faces on it and a scoop of ice cream on the side. I served it to her with delight. Because of my own issues with sugar and my concern about diabetes, the fact that it ran in families, and that people who had celiac had an added risk factor, I didn't offer many sweet desserts at our table. But on this day, I wanted to treat our daughter. What could it hurt? And again, Sydney relished the sugary moment, licking the icing from around her lips. 2 hours later, after the presents had been opened, the last games had been played, goodbyes had been said, and the leftover cake and pizza put away, the phone rang. Everyone but Sydney's grandparents, on Joel's side, had gone home. They were planning to pick up gluten-free to-go meals from Outback. When I picked up the phone, I heard Miss Audrey's voice. "How's the birthday girl? Did she enjoy the cake?" As I regaled my friend with the story of Sydney's excitement over the cake, I beckoned my daughter to the phone. Sydney seemed reluctant to talk, and I whispered, "It's Miss Audrey." She always enjoyed talking with Audrey, so I was surprised when she dragged her feet. "Don't forget to thank her for the cake," I whispered. Sydney obediently took the phone and slowly walked upstairs. I paused in my kitchen cleaning to listen to her side of the conversation. Her voice was soft. Sydney thanked Audrey and said a few yeses and uh-huhs. This was not their normally spirited exchange. I decided Sydney must be exhausted from the day. Sydney padded back downstairs to give me the phone, but her face was solemn. "Are you okay, sweetie?" I asked. "My tummy doesn't feel good." "Oh dear, I'm sorry, you probably overdid it." Sydney's normal diet was so healthy that it made sense she would feel a little sick to her stomach after the day's indulgences. Sydney leaned her head against me. "I probably ate too much pizza." "How many pieces did you have?" I asked, smiling. She hesitated. "5." "5?" No wonder she was feeling bad. "With cake and ice cream?" "Yeah, that's a lot for one small body," I said, looking into her brown eyes. "But it was so good, Mommy." I gave her a hug. "I know, honey, it's okay. Why don't you just rest a little bit and hopefully you'll feel better." Sydney picked up a stuffed calico kitten that one of her friends had given her and wandered into her bedroom. A moment later, I heard a gagging sound and then Sydney crying, "Mama, I threw up." I rushed over and saw sweat beading on her pale face. She was already gagging again, and she heaved the contents of her stomach into the porcelain bowl. Afterwards, I held her slight body in mine, washed her face with a warm towel as my mind reeled. Maybe Sydney's system couldn't handle all the sugar, all the pizza. Anyone could be nauseous after eating so much. But I sensed this was something more. I remembered the nutritionist sharing stories of her daughter's constant vomiting. "How are you doing, sweetie?" I looked into her face and saw misery. A few moments later, she threw up again. "I don't want to be sick," she cried. "It's my birthday." "I know, honey. I'm so sorry." I washed her face again and brought a chair into the bathroom. She sat on my lap and laid her head back against me. Each time she felt her stomach lurch, she stood up and bent over the toilet. Joel and his parents peeked in and stepped back, their faces etched with worry. Sydney gagged again and again every few minutes until her stomach was completely empty, and she continued dry heaving. It was as if her digestive system was trying to empty itself of any trace of whatever had offended it. It had to be gluten. But how? We'd been so careful. "It hurts," she wailed softly. I gave her small sips of water to wash out her mouth, and she continued throwing up until a yellow liquid came up, which I later learned was bile. I held her and prayed for the vomiting to end, wondering how much of this her body could take. It continued for 2 full hours until finally she was so weak, she was almost asleep in my arms. I half carried her to her bed with a large Tupperware bowl and sat with her as she gradually drifted off. And
Oh,
just, yeah, I know, poor thing.
I know.
But just to explain what actually, where the gluten was in that pizza, it was not in the crust. It was in the pizza sauce, which was made with modified food starch, which can have a little bit of wheat in it. And that was enough to just cause her body to go haywire.
That's unbelievable. So this brings up a question related, like all these everyday part of life things, that birthday parties, school activities, all these things that, you know, even eating out in restaurants. I mean, there's so much to think about, and even like friends and family who might not understand, right?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about how you adapted to all these things and events, and it was a whole lifestyle change, wasn't it?
It was, and I really grieved for probably a year Whereas Sydney adapted quicker because I guess she's a child and she hadn't had so many years of living the way I had, eating wheat. But I think the hardest thing is food is just a constant. You have to eat multiple times a day, and everyone else is doing it without a thought. And with Sydney, now and back then, I had to put that thought into every single bite that passed her lips, because even a crumb would cause her to be so sick. So, preparation. I mean, I first had to figure out how to just survive. And I try to make just a handful of meals that I knew would be safe. And then, like, one joke we have is in our family, I would make big pots of spaghetti with gluten-free sauce and gluten-free noodles. And I'd just keep that in the refrigerator, and Sydney would get spaghetti for almost, every meal for a week. And I'd be like, okay, at least I know she's not going to starve. But not being a cook, I was, not that good at it. So.
Okay. So speaking of not being a cook, that was one of your first lines after the initial part in your prologue. So what was this like for you, making this huge change?
They say I forget what the saying is, but like, if you want God to laugh, tell him your plan. And I thought, gosh, this is an interesting way that he's got me cooking, because I had just told, I remember telling my mom, I'm never going to cook. I'm not going to have to do that. And my husband, before we married, I'm like, you're not expecting me to cook, right? And suddenly, with a daughter with celiac, if I didn't cook, she was not going to eat. And so, all of that, you just throw it out the window and go, okay, I'll do it. And I will say there were a lot of fails. Sometimes I would try to make a cake or something, and I'd try to make it with low sugar because I thought, well, that'll be better for her. And Sydney would taste it and just be like, oh, Mom, this is gross. So we are all in our family very thankful that there are so many more gluten-free choices these days than there were back then. So they don't have to always eat my cooking. So we've kind of come full circle. I was cooking everything, and now I'm back to just cooking a few things.
Oh, good.
So yeah, there's life after celiac.
Here's an interesting question from Tamara. Anne, could you comment on people who claim, in quotes, to be gluten intolerant but are not? I've seen such people become quite preachy and intolerant themselves.
That is a very interesting thing. And I would say people in the celiac community have a really strong reaction against those people because they make it seem like it's really okay to eat a little bit of gluten, or to say I'm gluten intolerant, but then they eat what, mostly. And then, so the people with celiac are like, well, wait a minute, you're not really intolerant, and you're making a bad name for those of us who really are, or you're eating up all the gluten-free food that we really need to survive. So I don't know. It's hard to really understand what's going on in their heads.
Yeah, right. And then I think there was a part in your book too about maybe some family members not quite being on board.
Yes. I would say, most of them would eventually come on board, but I can talk about this now because they're not watching, but Joel's father has passed away and his mom is not computer savvy. So the grandparents were not totally on board in the beginning, and they would kind of question Joel, like, what is your wife doing to our granddaughter? Why is she doing this? And they eventually did come on board, and they over time became even more careful than I was. I'd say, well, this food is fine. And they'd be like, no, we need to check it. But in the beginning, they were pretty, they questioned me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad they came on board eventually. I would think seeing just one of her reactions would have changed.
Yes, that definitely helped. In fact, I think they were there for the 10th birthday, and it was before that they were not sure, and they would especially, they didn't like it because like Joel's mom was used to baking certain cookies or certain treats, and she couldn't do that anymore. And she'd be like, well, that's just wrong. Well, she should be able to eat that. And like, sorry.
Right. Okay. So, one question about writing, I thought this is from Beth. How did your 20 years reflecting on motherhood and writing about your experience as a daughter navigating your mother's illness impact the way you paid attention to this part of your life story? How did the experience of writing this book, the one that was like 15 years in the making, compare, or how did writing the second book compare to writing the first?
That is a great question, because there were definitely differences. And I would say it's kind of two parts. I paid attention, even though I didn't take notes throughout the experience of Sydney's celiac disease. Just being a writer and somebody who journals a lot, I paid attention to moments that did have a lot of resonance for me, or that were emotional in some strong way. And I would just write those details down. And in fact, as I was writing things for Celiac Mom, like when Sydney went to her prom and she had a gluten exposure, poor thing, she was throwing up and laying on the couch, and I'd be like jotting down a few things because I knew that this was going to be in the book. But what was different about the two books, because I really didn't know what I was doing with Motherhood Lost and Found, I revised and I revised and I revised. And I think I had more confidence when I came to Celiac Mom, and I thought, okay, I know what I'm doing. I very much didn't want it to take 20 years. And I said, I'm just going to take the scenes that mean the most to me, put them together, and I'm going to let it go before I revise the life out of it. So, I don't think I did that with Motherhood Lost and Found. I didn't have the confidence, so I kept working on it and editing more than I probably needed to.
We understand that, we writers.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, let me see if I've missed any. There was just, do we have time for one more, Beth? Okay. Do you have a regular write? This is from Tara or Tara. I don't. Do you have a regular writing habit now, and what does it look like, if you do? Or tell us about your writing process.
Okay. When I was writing Celiac Mom, I did have a regular habit. And I guess my habit is when I'm in the middle of a project, I try to write every day or 5 or 6 days a week. And I actually go into my office and I sit in a blue chair that I love, and I kind of call it my writing chair. And in that chair, I keep myself from editing. I just let it out. And then I'll go back at a different time and edit. But right now I am not in the middle of a writing project. So I journal here and there, and I need to get back into a writing project because I miss it.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, well, thank you very much. There are a few congratulations to you in the chat.
Thank you so much to everyone who came tonight.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you all so much for being here. And I invite you, as you're exiting, if you'd like to unmute, to just give a quick word of affirmation and congratulations to Anne. This event was a long time in the making, and I'm so glad that all of you could be here for it. And congratulations on Celiac Mom. And it's so nice to have a story that obviously this is an ongoing story and will be a part of your and Sydney's and Joel's lives forever, but it's so nice to hear you reflect on it from a positive and optimistic place. And that is something that lands really well right now, I think, for us. So thank you for sharing it with us. And as you exit, give a thanks, and we'll see you at the next event.